In the year 9 of the Common Era, beneath the canopy of the ancient Teutoburg Forest, the ground would drink the blood of 20,000 Roman soldiers. What unfolded in those dark woods was not merely a battle, but a betrayal so devastating that it would echo through the marble halls of Rome and forever alter the course of an empire. 3 entire legions, the pride of Augustus Caesar, would vanish into the German wilderness, their eagle standards lost, their bones left to bleach among the oak trees. This is the story of how one man's deception brought Rome to its knees and changed the fate of Europe forever. The morning mist clung to the Rhine like ghostly fingers as Roman soldiers prepared their gear along the eastern frontier. For decades, Rome had pushed deeper into the Germanic territories, establishing forts, collecting taxes, and imposing the iron will of the empire upon tribes that had never known such discipline. The conquest of Gaul under Julius Caesar had been a triumph of Roman arms and engineering. Germania, it seemed, would be next. The legions that marched through these forests carried with them the weight of Roman expectation and the confidence of a people who believed themselves destined to rule the world. But Germania was different. Unlike the organized cities of Gaul or the ancient kingdoms of the Mediterranean, this was a land of endless forests, treacherous bogs, and fierce tribal warriors who knew every path through the wilderness. The Romans had learned to respect Germanic ferocity on the battlefield, yet they believed that superior discipline, tactics, and equipment would eventually triumph. After all, had they not conquered peoples from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the banks of the Euphrates? What could these barbarian tribes possibly do against the unstoppable might of Rome? The man who would answer that question stood among the Romans themselves, trusted, honored, and completely undetected. Arminius was his Roman name, though he had been born with another among the Cherusci tribe. Tall, intelligent, and possessed of a natural charisma that drew men to follow him, he had served Rome faithfully for years. He spoke perfect Latin, understood Roman military tactics, and had earned the respect of his commanders through courage and skill in battle. To the Romans, he was proof that Germanic peoples could be civilized, that they could be brought into the empire not merely as subjects, but as citizens and allies. What the Romans did not know was that behind those calculating eyes burned a fire that no amount of Roman gold or honors could extinguish. Arminius had seen the glory of Rome, walked its streets, and witnessed the wealth that flowed into the capital from conquered lands. But he had also seen what Roman rule meant for his people. He had watched as Roman tax collectors stripped Germanic villages bare, as Roman judges imposed laws that meant nothing to tribal traditions, as Roman governors treated proud warriors like children to be scolded and controlled. The turning point had come gradually. Perhaps it was watching his own people bow before Roman officials, or seeing ancient tribal customs dismissed as barbaric superstitions. Perhaps it was the realization that for all his honors and citizenship, he would always be seen as a useful barbarian rather than a true equal. Whatever the catalyst, Arminius began to harbor a vision that would have horrified his Roman friends. He dreamed of a Germania free from Roman rule, united under his leadership, strong enough to stand against the legions that had conquered the known world. The key to his plan was deception on a scale that defied imagination. Arminius understood that the Germanic tribes, for all their courage, could never defeat Rome in open battle. The legions were too disciplined, too well-equipped, too experienced in the art of war. But what if the legions could be lured into terrain where their advantages meant nothing? What if they could be caught scattered, confused, and vulnerable? What if the very trust they placed in their Germanic allies could be turned into a weapon against them? For months, Arminius worked in shadow and silence. He sent secret messengers to tribal chiefs who had chafed under Roman rule, speaking of unity, of freedom, of the chance to drive the invaders back across the Rhine. It was dangerous work. A single betrayal would mean crucifixion, the standard Roman punishment for rebellion. But Arminius was careful, patient, and above all, utterly convincing. One by one, the chiefs agreed to follow him. The Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Marsi, the Chatti, tribes that had fought each other for generations, began to forge a secret alliance built on shared hatred of their Roman oppressors. The target of this conspiracy was Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania and commander of the Rhine legions. Varus was a man of considerable political skill and ruthless efficiency. He had served as governor of Syria, and had proven his ability to extract wealth and obedience from conquered peoples through a combination of harsh justice and calculated brutality. Augustus had sent him to Germania with a clear mandate to transform the tribal territories into a proper Roman province, complete with cities, roads, and the full apparatus of imperial administration. Varus commanded 3 full legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, elite formations with decades of campaign experience. Each legion at full strength numbered close to 5,000 men, heavily armed and armored professional soldiers who had sworn an oath to serve Rome unto death. Supporting them were auxiliary units drawn from allied tribes, cavalry squadrons, and the vast logistical apparatus that kept a Roman army in the field. In total, Varus had perhaps 20,000 men under his command, a force capable of crushing any Germanic army foolish enough to meet it in open battle. But Arminius was far too clever to offer open battle. Throughout the summer of 9, he played his role to perfection, serving as Varus's trusted advisor and guide. He provided intelligence on tribal movements, helped negotiate with local chiefs, and gave every appearance of a loyal Roman ally. Varus, confident in his own judgment and pleased with Arminius's service, never suspected that his most trusted Germanic ally was also his deadliest enemy. As autumn approached and the campaign season drew to a close, Varus prepared to lead his legions back to their winter quarters along the Rhine. It would be a routine march through territory the Romans considered pacified. The baggage trains were loaded with the spoils of a successful season, tribute collected from the tribes, and supplies for the long winter ahead. The soldiers, veterans of many campaigns, looked forward to comfortable quarters, hot meals, and letters from home. It was then that Arminius struck with his masterstroke. He came to Varus with disturbing news of a rebellion in the distant territories, far from the established Roman roads. A tribe had risen against Roman authority, attacked a supply convoy, and was reportedly gathering other malcontents to their cause. It was exactly the sort of situation that demanded immediate action. Left unchecked, such rebellions had a way of spreading, and Varus could not afford to let defiance go unpunished. Arminius offered his services as a guide, volunteering to lead the legions by the most direct route to crush this uprising before it could gain momentum. It would mean deviating from the safe, established roads and marching through difficult terrain, but it would also demonstrate Roman power to any who might be tempted to follow the rebels' example. Varus, trusting his Germanic advisor completely, agreed to the plan. What followed was a masterclass in deception. Arminius had not simply invented a rebellion. He had created an entire false narrative, complete with fabricated evidence and carefully coached witnesses. Every detail was designed to convince Varus that immediate action was necessary, and that only Arminius could guide the Romans safely through the treacherous forest paths to their destination. As the legions prepared to march into the Teutoburg Forest, following paths known only to their Germanic guides, they had no idea they were walking into the most carefully prepared trap in military history. Behind them lay the familiar roads and forts of Roman Germania. Ahead lay a green hell where 20,000 of Rome's finest would meet their doom. The forest closed around the Roman column like the jaws of some primordial beast. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches so thick they blotted out the autumn sun, casting the world below into a perpetual twilight. The air hung heavy with moisture and the smell of rotting leaves, while underfoot the ground squelched with mud that seemed to pull at every step. This was the Teutoburg Forest, a wilderness so dense and forbidding that even the Germanic tribes spoke of it in hushed tones. For the Roman soldiers, accustomed to the straight roads and open country that their engineers had carved across the empire, this was alien territory. The baggage train stretched for miles behind them, a serpentine line of wagons, pack animals, and camp followers that moved with agonizing slowness through the narrow forest paths. Mules brayed in protest as their loads caught on overhanging branches. Wagon wheels sank deep into the soft earth, requiring dozens of men to push them free. What should have been a swift march to crush a minor rebellion had become a grinding ordeal of endurance. The legionaries themselves began to feel the strain. These were hardened veterans, men who had marched across deserts and through mountain passes, but the forest was different. Here, they could not see more than a few dozen paces in any direction. The familiar comfort of tight formations became impossible as the column was forced to stretch and bend around trees, rocks, and stream-sume. Discipline remained firm that appeared without warning from the good luck. But beneath the surface, unease began to grow. At the head of the column, Varus rode in conversation with his Germanic guides, Arminius chief among them. The Roman commander showed no sign of concern, trusting completely in his allies' knowledge of the terrain. Arminius spoke confidently of the route ahead, assuring Varus that they would reach the rebellious tribe within 2 days and crush them before word of their approach could spread. His Roman officer would expect from a trusted auxiliary manner was calm, professional, everything a behind those steady eyes he would have witnessed commander. But if Varus could have seen willingly into the killing ground, the cold calculation of a predator watching its prey walked, every twist in the path, every boggy stream crossing, every narrowing of the trail had been chosen with lethal precision. Arminius was not simply guiding the Romans to their destination, he was herding them like cattle toward the slaughter. The first day's march proceeded without incident, though the going was harder than anyone had anticipated. As evening approached, Varus called a halt and ordered the construction of a marching camp. Even in this wilderness, Roman discipline asserted itself. Engineers surveyed the ground, marking out the familiar rectangular shape that had sheltered Roman armies from Britain to Mesopotamia. Legionaries dug trenches and raised earthworks while others gathered wood for fires and established sentry posts. Within hours, a fortress had risen from the forest floor, complete with gates, towers, and all the comforting routine of Roman military life. Around the campfires, soldiers cleaned their equipment and shared rations of bread, cheese, and wine. Veterans told stories of past campaigns while newer recruits listened with rapt attention. Officers made their rounds, checking on sentries and ensuring that all was in order for the night. To any observer, this was a Roman army at the height of its power and confidence, a machine of war that had conquered half the world and seemed destined to conquer the rest. Yet beyond the ring of firelight, unseen watchers moved through the darkness. Germanic scouts, warriors loyal to Arminius, observed every detail of the Roman camp. They counted sentries, noted the positions of officers' tents, and memorized the layout of defenses. Then they melted back into the forest, carrying their intelligence to hidden encampments, where thousands of tribal warriors waited in silence for the signal to strike. Dawn brought a steady drizzle that turned the forest paths into streams of mud. The Roman column reformed with mechanical efficiency, but the conditions made every mile a battle against the elements. Armor grew heavy with moisture. Leather straps stretched and slipped, and the footing became treacherous. Still, the legions pressed forward, driven by duty and the promise that their ordeal would soon end. It was on the second day that the first signs of trouble appeared. Scouts reported movement in the trees, shadowy figures that vanished whenever pursuit was attempted. A supply wagon disappeared during a river crossing, its guards found dead with Germanic spears in their backs. Isolated soldiers sent to gather firewood failed to return to their units. Each incident was small, easily explained, but together they painted a picture that should have alarmed any experienced commander. Varus, however, remained confident. Arminius assured him that these were merely bandits and deserters, the sort of scum that infested any frontier region. The rebellion they sought to crush had probably attracted such rabble, but they posed no serious threat to a Roman army. The general accepted this explanation without question, his trust in his Germanic advisor remaining absolute, even as the evidence mounted that something was terribly wrong. The trap was closing with methodical precision. Ahead lay a narrow defile, where the path squeezed between a hill and an impassable bog. Here, centuries of wind and rain had carved a corridor barely wide enough for the Roman column to pass in single file. It was the perfect killing ground, a place where numbers would mean nothing and the legion's tactical superiority would be neutralized by the terrain itself. As the vanguard entered the defile, Germanic warriors rose from concealed positions along the hillside, like deadly flowers blooming in the morning light. War cries echoed through the forest as thousands of painted fighters emerged from hiding places that had been prepared for months. Spears and arrows rained down on the packed Roman column, while the narrow confines of the pass made it impossible to deploy into battle formation. The ambush had begun, and with it, the destruction of 3 Roman legions. In the space of heartbeats, Varus's confident army had become a confused mass of men and animals, trapped in a corridor of death with enemies on all sides and nowhere to run. The Germanic war cries that filled the air carried more than just the fury of battle. They carried the promise of freedom and the rage of a people pushed beyond endurance. Arminius, his deception finally revealed, drew his sword and turned it against the Romans he had served so faithfully. His voice joined the chorus of war cries as he called upon his warriors to show no mercy to the invaders who had come to enslave their homeland. The man who had been Rome's most trusted ally in Germania had become its most deadly enemy, and the forest would soon run red with Roman blood. The first volleys of Germanic spears and arrows struck the Roman column like thunderbolts from a clear sky. In the narrow defile, packed shoulder to shoulder with no room to maneuver, the legionaries became sitting targets for warriors positioned high on the hillsides. Men who had survived campaigns across the empire fell screaming as iron points found gaps in their armor. Horses reared and plunged, adding to the chaos as baggage wagons overturned and blocked the already narrow passage. Centurions roared orders above the din, their voices cutting through the confusion as they tried to restore some semblance of formation. These were veteran officers, men who had faced cavalry charges and siege assaults, and they knew that panic meant death. Drawing their swords, they began to gather scattered legionaries around the sacred standards, those golden eagles that represented the honor and soul of each legion. If they could form defensive squares, if they could present a wall of shields to their attackers, they might yet fight their way out of this nightmare. But the Germanic warriors had learned their lessons well. This was not a wild charge born of rage and fury, but a calculated assault planned down to the smallest detail. As Roman soldiers attempted to lock shields and form their famous testudo formations, fresh waves of arrows arced down from the hillsides. The warriors above had the luxury of time and position, able to pick their targets carefully while the Romans below struggled simply to stay alive. The narrow pass became a charnel house. Bodies piled upon bodies as men fell and were trampled by their own comrades. The wounded screamed for help that could not come, while the dead were pushed aside to make room for the living to continue their desperate fight. Blood mixed with mud and rainwater, creating a slick crimson paste that made footing treacherous. The smell of death began to mingle with the damp earth and rotting leaves of the ancient forest. From his position near the front of the column, Varus could see his carefully ordered army disintegrating before his eyes. The realization of his betrayal struck him like a physical blow. Arminius, the man he had trusted above all others, stood among the Germanic warriors with a bloodied sword in his hand and triumph blazing in his eyes. The rebellion they had marched to crush had been a fiction, a masterful lie designed to lead them into this killing ground. Every mile of their journey, every decision he had made, had been guided by treachery. The Roman commander's mind reeled as he grasped the full scope of the deception. How long had Arminius been planning this? How many others were involved? The Germanic auxiliaries who served in his own army, were they loyal, or were they waiting for the signal to turn their weapons on their Roman comrades? The guides who had led them through the forest paths, the scouts who had reported safe passage ahead, how many of them had been part of this elaborate trap? As if reading his thoughts, Germanic war horns sounded from multiple directions. The assault on the defile was only the beginning. All along the stretched Roman column, hidden warriors emerged from the forest like wolves materializing from shadow. The auxiliary units, those Germanic allies who had served Rome faithfully for years, suddenly turned their spears upon their Roman officers. In a single coordinated moment, 20,000 Romans found themselves surrounded by enemies on all sides. The betrayal cut deeper than any sword. Roman soldiers who had shared meals and marched side by side with their Germanic allies now faced them across a line of steel and death. Trust, the foundation upon which Roman military success had been built, crumbled like ancient parchment. Men who had sworn oaths of loyalty revealed their true allegiance with the swing of an axe or the thrust of a spear. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds and complete betrayal, the legions did not break. These were professional soldiers, men who had taken an oath to serve Rome unto death, and they would honor that oath even here in the green hell of the Teutoburg Forest. Centurions continued to rally their men, forming defensive circles around the legion standards. Veterans grabbed younger soldiers who showed signs of panic, steadying them with gruff words and iron discipline. The battle became a series of desperate stands as isolated groups of Romans fought with the fury of cornered lions. A century of the 19th Legion formed a shield wall around a broken wagon, holding their ground for precious hours as Germanic warriors hurled themselves against the bristling wall of Gladii. The eagle-bearer of the 17th, his standard clutched in a death grip, fought until Germanic spears finally brought him down, the sacred eagle falling into enemy hands for the first time in living memory. Individual acts of heroism blazed like stars in the gathering darkness. A wounded Optio rallied the remnants of his century and led a desperate charge that broke through Germanic lines, only to find more enemies waiting beyond. A group of Roman engineers, trapped away from the main force, used their tools and skills to construct makeshift fortifications from fallen trees, holding out against repeated assaults until their ammunition ran dry and they were overrun. The forest itself seemed to conspire against the Romans. Every stream became an obstacle, every fallen log a barrier that broke up formations and isolated units from one another. The Germanic warriors, born and raised in these woodlands, moved through the terrain like ghosts, appearing from behind trees to strike and then vanishing before the Romans could respond. They used the forest as a weapon, channeling Roman movements into prepared killing zones where crossfire could devastate entire centuries. As the hours passed and the slaughter continued, the true scope of Arminius's achievement became clear. This was not simply an ambush, but a masterpiece of military planning that had turned every Roman strength into a weakness. Their heavy armor, so effective on open battlefields, became a burden in the tangled undergrowth. Their disciplined formations, the key to victory in countless campaigns, could not be maintained in terrain that forced them into single file. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they were scattered and confused, unable to concentrate their force against a single target. The Germanic coalition that Arminius had forged moved with a unity that would have been impossible just months before. Traditional enemies fought side by side, united by their hatred of Roman rule and their faith in the man who had promised them freedom. The Cherusci warriors who formed the core of Arminius's following were joined by Bructeri spearmen, Marsi archers, and Chatti axemen, each tribe contributing their particular skills to the common cause. The psychological impact of the betrayal proved almost as devastating as the physical assault. Roman soldiers, trained to expect treachery from obvious enemies, found themselves questioning every face, every voice, every movement around them. Which of their allies could be trusted? Which Germanic guides were leading them to safety, and which were herding them toward fresh ambushes? The paranoia and uncertainty sapped morale as effectively as any weapon. By the second day of fighting, the Roman column had been shattered into dozens of isolated fragments, each fighting its own desperate battle for survival. Some groups attempted to break through Germanic lines and reach the safety of the Rhine fortifications, only to find fresh enemies waiting at every river crossing and forest path. Others tried to build fortified camps where they could make a stand, but the wet terrain and lack of proper tools made effective fortifications impossible. The weather itself seemed to favor the Germanic cause. Rain fell in steady sheets, turning the forest floor into a quagmire that bogged down Roman movements while leaving the lightly equipped tribal warriors free to maneuver. The constant moisture made it nearly impossible to keep bowstrings dry or maintain fires for warmth and cooking. Roman discipline, legendary for its ability to sustain armies through any hardship, began to crack under the relentless pressure. Varus, witnessing the destruction of everything he had built in Germania, made one final attempt to salvage something from the catastrophe. Gathering the remnants of his personal guard and what remained of the legion commanders, he ordered a desperate breakout attempt toward the nearest Roman fortification. If even a few hundred men could escape to carry word of the disaster, perhaps some meaning could be salvaged from the slaughter. The breakout began before dawn on the third day, with Varus himself leading the charge through what appeared to be a gap in the Germanic encirclement. For a brief moment, it seemed that Roman courage and desperation might overcome even these impossible odds. The small force of survivors carved through initial resistance, their gladii flashing in the grey morning light as they fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. But Arminius had anticipated even this final gambit. The apparent gap was another trap, a carefully prepared killing ground where the last organized Roman resistance would be crushed. As Varus and his men plunged forward, Germanic warriors closed in from all sides like the jaws of a steel trap. The sound of clashing metal and dying men echoed through the forest as the final act of the tragedy played out beneath the ancient oaks. When the last sword fell silent and the final war cry faded into the forest mist, the unthinkable had happened. 3 of Rome's finest legions lay destroyed, their eagles captured, their standards trampled into the German mud. Varus himself, rather than face the shame of capture, fell upon his sword as Roman honor demanded. In the space of 3 days, Arminius had accomplished what no enemy of Rome had managed in centuries: the complete annihilation of an entire army. The news of the disaster reached Augustus like a thunderbolt. The emperor who had conquered the known world was said to have beaten his head against the palace walls, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Those legion numbers, 17, 18, and 19, would never be used again. The dream of Roman Germania died in the Teutoburg Forest, and the Rhine became a permanent frontier rather than a stepping stone to further conquest. Arminius had changed the course of history with a single brilliant deception. His victory ensured that Germanic culture would survive and flourish, that the tribes beyond the Rhine would remain free from Roman rule. The map of Europe itself was redrawn by what happened in those dark woods, and the echoes of that ancient betrayal still shape the world we know today. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from strength or numbers, but from the courage to deceive those who would enslave you.